This video begins a series of lessons about the object-oriented features of VisualBasic.net. We'll start by talking about classes and objects and try to understand the relationship between classes and objects, how to create a class, and how to instantiate an object. The first thing that's important is to make a distinction between classes and objects. Many times, developers use these terms interchangeably, but I like to make one small distinction. A class is a definition, or rather a blueprint, and the object is the result of implementing that blueprint. So just as an architect designs the plans for a house, and then a construction crew will actually use those plans and implement the plans and build a house, in a similar manner, you as a software developer will create classes in VB.net. And then others, or maybe you will use those classes within your applications and create instances, or rather instantiate, that's a term that's sometimes used, instantiate those classes and bring them to life into objects. And those objects can be used within the context of the application. You can use the properties of those objects, and you can also call them methods of those objects within your application. And so objects and classes are simply collections of properties and functions that are known as methods that are somehow related to each other. So what we'll do now is take our very simple class that I've created and explain the different parts of it. Suppose we wanted to create a class that represents a product within our ordering system. And so we're going to try and model this product in a generic way so that it can be used to describe a Nerf football, a pencil, a package of paper, and a lamp, or whatever we might sell at our store. And so in a very, very simple way, what we've done is modeled the concept of a product within our class. So the first thing that we've done was that we created a class called product, and then we created two properties. And the first property is defined here. The product will have a name. In other words, the lamp, football, pencil, whatever. And another property is defined here as the ID. And we'll use this as the identifier, or a numerical value that might be saved in the database, but somehow represents that product so that we can identify it numerically. Additionally, we have a method called calculate, and this method will actually, determine the discount, for example, of the product if it's to be sold. Now we're just making this fictitious example up. Obviously you'd want a much more complex class structure to describe what a product is. A product is not just simply an ID and a name, and you can't just calculate a discount. You would obviously calculate subtax, or the subtotal, a taxable amount, how much we paid for it, and all these types of things. But again, we're keeping this fairly simple. Now, you'll also notice that there is something called public and private. This simply means that when an application calls or creates an instance of our product object, or our product class, that it can automatically see a property called name, but it cannot see a property called m_id. What we've done here is create a private property, which we designate the private properties as m_id, and then we'll make that ID or identifier available to the application that created an instance of our class through the use of this public property ID statement. In this statement, what we've done is controlled the access to the ID by saying public property ID if get ID equals m_id. So this is a way to retrieve values from the property, and if you wanted to set the values of this property, you would use the second statement, which is set. So in this case, we'll set the private variable ID equal to the value that was passed in. And we'll see an example of this in just a moment. But the concept that we want to get across is that classes have some members, in other words, some properties and some methods that are visible to the application that created it, and some properties and methods that are invisible to the application that created it. Classes also have a lifetime. They have a lifespan. You'll create an instance of a class, so you'll have a live product object that's in memory and that is actually alive in memory. And when you create that new product, there will actually be a chunk of code that gets run every time, and that's called a constructor. And here is an example of a constructor. Public sub new, so every time a new instance of the product class is created, what we'll do is, first of all, write out to the debug window the word new, and then we'll also initialize our m_id private property to the value 0. So the constructor is a good place to do any preparatory work, such as create connections to a database or initialize any values that are going to be used within our object that was created from an instance of the class. While the object is living, you can call properties and methods of the class, and then at some point your application will decide to close, or rather destroy, the instance of this class. It no longer needs the product class that it's created into an object, and so it's going to destroy the object. And when that happens, it's customary to have what's called a destructor. And there are two types of destructors in VB.NET. The first one is something we'll call dispose. And in C#, dispose has a much more important role than it does in Visual Basic.NET. What we'll do here is clean up any objects that this class has created, such as connections to a database, or it'll deinitialize any values. It might store off values before it's destroyed. But this method has to be called explicitly by your application. There is another type of destructor that is created within Visual Basic.NET, and that is the finalize method. And this method is called by something called the garbage collector. And we'll talk about constructors and destructors in much greater detail. But for the time being, whenever your object goes out of scope, .NET, the framework, takes care of cleaning up any of the memory and reallocates it to be used again for other applications or for continued processing by this application. And therefore, it'll call the finalize method. So if you need to have anything cleaned up, like other objects, but or connections to the database, or whatever the case might be, you can do that here as well. There is a difference between the dispose and the finalize methods, and we'll make that distinction in the video regarding constructors and destructors later on in this series. But for right now, just understand the concept that whenever an object gets instanced, it will, first of all, have code in the constructor that's run, and then finally when it goes out of scope or when it's destroyed, it'll have a destructor that can be run for it. Finally, what we'll do in this video is show you how to create an instance of our product class that we created. First of all, notice that I've created a very simple console application, and therefore we defined our class product, in the same physical file as the module that was created by default whenever we go to create a console application. In order for this to get run, we must have a submain within our application, and so that's the function of the submain. This will get run first, and we could actually create a class, and if the submain or any of the other functions or any other code never creates an instance of this class, our class code will never get run. So that's an important distinction to make. But what we do at the very outset of the submain is to actually dimension a variable called pProduct as a new instance of the product object. And so the next thing we do, once we've got an instance of our product class called pProduct, we actually populate the name property. So we're going to name this a widget, and we also set the product ID equal to 3. And here we're reading the product ID. And now we've dimensioned another variable called iCalc as integer, which is equal to the product object that we created, and we call its calculate method. And then finally we take the value of iCalc and write that out to the console window. So let's see this in action. What we'll do is place a breakpoint here, and we'll step through the code. Actually, let's set a breakpoint on the very first line. So here we go. We'll step into our application. To begin the application, I'm going to select the Run button. And notice that since this is a console application, that the little console window popped up. But since the very first line of code is set to a breakpoint, the Visual Studio.NET IDE takes focus and comes back to the front. So as we're walking through the code, you'll see the yellow line displaying where the code is currently running. And we'll talk more about debugging applications in a different series in regards to debugging console applications. I'll assume that you've already looked that over and understand the concepts that we're doing here. But essentially, we're walking through each line of code. So what I'm going to do is start selecting the F11 key, which will allow me to step line by line through our code. So the first thing we do is create an instance of the product class. So notice that we've jumped up to the very top of our code where we've defined our class. In fact, as you see, that's the very top. And we've come to this public sub new because, again, this is the constructor. It gets run the very first time that the class is created. So now this method is run. And so it has completed the first task of creating an instance of the object. The next thing is that we're going to populate the name property, which is a public property, or rather a public field. A little bit different than a property, and we'll make that distinction in a future video. But what we're going to do is populate the name property, which we've done. We'll populate the ID property. Now, since this is not a field, but rather a property, we actually get into our public property ID as integer, set by val value as integer. And so whatever value that was passed in, as you can see the little pop-up help, value equals 3, that will be set to the private variable m_id. You can see that it is now 3 as well. So now the next thing that we'll do is actually read that value from our object that we created and write it to the console. So now we're back to the public property ID as integer. This time a get is performed. So we're going to set the value ID, which is currently 0, equal to 3 in this line of code, and now it's equal to 3, and that gets written out to the console window, which we can't see. The next thing we're going to do is call the calculate method of the product object. And so the first thing we do is write out calculate to the console window. Can't see it. And then we're going to actually perform a calculation. We're going to take the private variable m_id and multiply it by 5 and return that value to the caller of the calculate method. And so now iCalc equals 15, 3 times 5. And then we're going to write the value of iCalc, converting it to a string, to the console window. So what I'm going to do is take my mouse cursor and click on the console window, and notice that we have 3, calculate, and 15. These are the values that were written out to the console window as we performed the application. And so now we've reached the end of our submain, and our application exits. So what we tried to do in this video is to explain the concept of classes, display what a class looked like in Visual Basic.net, explain the different features of a class. For example, a class has properties, a class has methods. So those properties and methods can be private or they can be public. And then we also showed how to create a constructor, which gets run every time that a class is actually created, and then a destructor, and we noticed that there's 2 different types of destructors that we can create. And then finally, we showed how to actually create an instance of the object, how to call properties to set them and also retrieve information from those properties, and finally how to call methods and retrieve values from those methods and display information as a result. So we hope that this video was very informative and that you learned a lot about classes and objects in Visual Basic.net. These are the cornerstones of understanding the object-oriented features of Visual Basic.net, and we hope that you'll take some more time to learn more about classes and objects. We're going to discuss them more fully in the next several videos, but ultimately you'll probably need to get your hands dirty and actually write some code in order to get a feel for what classes can do for you. As is noted in the notes of the video, taking an object-oriented approach to development often simplifies very complex problems by breaking them into and compartmentalizing them into logical congregations of functionality, if you will. And so we hope that you enjoyed this video and that it was helpful in your understanding of the object-oriented features of Visual Studio.net or Visual Basic.net. Thank you, and have a great day.